constitutional amendments. And I was unaware that there were going to be constitutional amendments on the ballot. And as a result, I posted something to YouTube. I posted something to social media saying, hey, who has been talking about this? You know, who has some background, who has some insight? So I had a couple of people to respond. And then I decided, well, I think it would be wonderful if we could have a dialogue to help people have a better understanding, not only of the amendments, but of the context of the amendments, how they appeared on our ballot, and what the impacts could be, positive and negative. So we're not here to tell you how to vote. We're not here to weigh one side or the other. We're not here in any kind of partisan way. We're here simply to share this information with you. And I'm so glad that we have these 4 talented experts joining us today who can shed some light on this subject. So the first thing I thought I would do is to show you, and I'm going to try to share my screen because I do have the amendments. Okay, can I share the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to attempt to do that. Okay, well, it's not letting me do that, so I'm just going to have to read you the amendments, which is fine. Hold on. I'm going to let you know what they say. Okay, so we have 2 amendments. And I'm going to, okay, I'm trying to find them. Y'all bear with me. Gotta find, okay, here it is. Okay. So these were actually posted on my sample ballot, and I assume everyone's sample ballot in SC votes on August 15th, 2022. So they've been there a minute, as they say. So it reads the following. The following constitutional amendment questions will appear on ballot November 8th, 2022 in the general election. Amendment 1, must Section 36A, Article 3 of the Constitution of this state related to the General Reserve Fund be amended so as to provide that the General Reserve Fund of 5% of general fund revenue of the latest completed fiscal year must be increased each year by 0.5% of the general fund revenue of the latest completed fiscal year until it equals 7% of such revenues. So that's asking for an increase of the General Reserve Fund to 5%. The second question, must Section 36B, Article 3 of the Constitution of the state be amended so as to provide that the Capital Reserve Fund of 2% of the general fund revenue of the latest completed fiscal year be increased to 3% of the general fund revenue of the latest completed fiscal year, and to provide that the first use of the Capital Reserve Fund must be to offset mid-year budget reductions. Now, are your eyes crossed yet? So with that said, I'd like to bring Dr. Ulbrich on to give us a little bit of background on, General Reserve Fund, Capital Reserve Fund. What are they talking about?
Okay. Well, as you can tell by my white hair, I've been around South Carolina for a very long time. And I remember a thing called the Budget and Control Board and mid-year budget cuts. And when the state has mid-year budget cuts, it's really hard to cut because most of what they pay for is salary. They're not producing widgets or anything like that. They're producing services, and that's very labor intensive. So we don't want to be in a recession and having the state have to lay people off or raise taxes or some of those other things. So the thing that protects us a little bit is to have a reserve fund. So they created the reserve fund. We have not taken money out of the reserve fund since the 2008 housing crisis. So it's just been sitting there as our savings account in the bank at 5%, and it goes up every year. Usually the revenue goes up enough so that they have to add a little bit to it, but it's not that much. And the way it works, say you had $100 million budget, that's not even close, but that's a nice round number. Okay, so you'd have to have 5% of 100 million or $5 million in the reserve fund. And the next year you went up to 110 million, so you'd have to increase it to 5.5 million. That number 5% comes from an organization called the National Association of State Budget Officers, which we're part of. And it is recommended, and had been recommended for a long time, as an appropriate number, because 47 of the 50 states have some kind of reserve fund. They're all different. Some of them dump surpluses in it. They do various things. But we just follow this recommendation that we have a nice little savings account. But the problem is, if we have a big, long recession, it can run out. And so more recently, NASBO has recommended expanding it. They didn't give a specific target, but they recommended expanding it. So because we certainly didn't have enough during the great housing meltdown of 2008, 2009. Now, when there's a recession, which we're not sure we're in because unemployment is so low, that doesn't make it a recession. But when you're in a recession, the government tries to help hold up employment and hold up economic activity, keep it going by either cutting taxes or increasing spending. But states, every state but one, has to balance its budget. So we can't do that. We can't go out and borrow to get through a recession in South Carolina. So that's why we have a reserve sign. So we borrow from ourselves. So the increase to 7%, I think, is probably a measure that's consistent with what's recommended by people who think a lot about state budgets. Now that's the general reserve. Then there's the capital reserve, which is even less complicated because they authorize capital spending. They have a list of capital projects. But what if they get in a recession and we don't have the money to fund it? Well, that's what the capital reserve fund is for. But first, it has to be available for the recession. And then at the end of the fiscal year, if we had a budget surplus or a balanced budget and we can release those funds, then they're released for whatever capital projects are online, or they can be used to pay down debt. So that one is not like the reserve fund that just sort of stays steady and accumulates a little bit as the budget grows. The capital reserve fund is normally, in most normal years, it's spent on capital projects and then it's replenished the next year. So as an economist, I think this is good economic policy, but that may not be the only consideration. That's just the lens through which I view this. And I'm not always in agreement with all of my economics colleagues on many issues, but this is one where I think the economic consensus would be pretty firm. Catherine?
Okay, so let me, one thing that I wanted to do is to play a clip from the state budget director, because if we want to know how we got here, we got here through the legislature and starting with the Senate, as a matter of fact. So this is a bill that came out of the Senate committee and was approved through a joint resolution. So what we had was a joint resolution, both houses, everyone voted in favor. And because it is a constitutional amendment, it had to come before us, the voters, in order to go to the next stage. But I want to try to play some of the state budget director's comments because he gives, and this was a meeting of March 3rd of this year at the Senate Finance Committee. So I want to play some of this because he gave a good history of kind of where we are and how we got here. So I'm going to try to play that and hopefully we can hear it. So hold on, everybody. I'm gonna roll tape on this.
We can dig into this data all day long about 9 million different directions. It seems about right.
Okay, before I do that, I'm going to ask for some feedback on the comments that Dr. Ulbrich made. So we have Paul Palmer, who is with the South Carolina Poor People's Campaign. And he has also been following a lot of this budget activity very closely. I want to get some comments from you, Paul, on what some of your concerns are as someone who is committed to helping the poor. And as a reflection of that, what are some thoughts you have on some of Dr. Ulbrich's remarks?
Well, first I'll say that the Poor People's Campaign is not formally prepared to weigh in on this.
Mhm.
I just sit in as a volunteer for the organization in the state of South Carolina, doing events and things. But I have been authorized to address this issue by our state committee in this context, and that is, I'll put that in this context. So I'm primarily speaking for myself and as a member rather than a representative. We do have some people who are economists at Columbia University that give us some advice nationally, but we don't have such resources at a state level. So, but nevertheless, I believe that the current reserve fund and capital reserve fund is generally satisfactory for what it is. When I listen to what Dr. Ulbrich said about increasing it to 7%, well, in effect, they don't use the same labels, but we have 7% when you put those two funds together. And they give us a cushion for state employees that it would have to be cut, and in the event of a recession, significant recession like what we had in 2008, that could come again. It could wipe it out. But on the other hand, I question the concern to save money for any and all perils. It's like driving an automobile. You know, you need to have some money to be able to fix it, but you don't need to have enough money to buy a brand new car if you crash it and you don't have collision insurance. If you're relatively prosperous and you can buy another car within short order, you don't need to have that, and you don't have to keep the savings going to replace that immediately. But I think that, of course, the people who would be hurt the most and least able to be resilient would be our less well-paid state employees, such as our janitorial staff or the line clerical workers or the people who work for the Department of Transportation on the roads at the lowest levels. They're the ones that be less resilient to being laid off or having to be put furloughed. But I think what we have is good enough as is.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Shaw, what are some things that come up to mind at this moment for you?
Well, thank you. I'm happy to join you this afternoon, just to give my perspective. And I told Ms. Bruce that I'm an expert on a few things. Public finance is not my strength, but I'm a quick enough learner, and I've discussed enough of local public financing to have at least a perspective on this. So to Mr. Palmer's concern, I think I share that in this respect, that of course, there's the broader concern about how the governor and the legislature allocate and set budget priorities that meet the needs of working class and low income families. And so that's the overall question of the framework is one for voters to certainly take into mind as you go into the voting booth, as to how should our budget reflect our values, and that's always a broader concern. I've often heard economists included that budgets are normative or moral documents on some respects because they do reflect those priorities or don't reflect those priorities. So that's just sort of a broader point, not editorializing too much, but just telling you what you already know. I think I've taken a look at a little bit of a look at what the Center for Budget Policy and Priorities has said. And it's interesting because they make an argument that actually this 3% and 5% or these percentage increases, which effectively would take this reserve and capital fund up to 10%, is too low. Now, what is their argument of it being of 10% being too low, whereas those two funds are now 7%? And again, voters, you can simply think of this. It's sort of the very shorthand way of thinking about this is our savings accounts. In some respects. Now that's exactly what they are, but to explain it when you're standing in line at the voting booth and others are asking you about these amendments, you can kind of give a sense of, well, what's the reserve funds or savings that the state has in times of downturn. Well, the Center for Budget Policy and Priorities make this argument that really you need 15% if you really want to hold harmless particularly vulnerable populations. So for one example is African Americans, and as they noted in their research, as they're pulling from other sort of research that has been done on this question of downturns during hard times, that African Americans, African American women are employed in those sectors that are most likely to be laid off. So if we're talking about public administration, health, education, those are professions where minoritized populations are employed and can be disproportionately feel the effects of a downturn. The Great Recession, as we popularly refer to it, of 2008 and 2009, and this sort of very uneven and mixed. Not quite recovery, because we know how high inflation is currently, and certainly what happened with the post-pandemic period. So their argument again is that you have two things that need to go on. One, that you really need to decide if in fact that if you have enough of a reserve to hold harmless and were you to have a significant downturn. So that's the first point that they make, and I'm not going to take a position on that, but I want to just sort of share that with you. The second thing they make a case about, so they would say in effect that the 10% is not sufficient, at least by their conclusions. The second point they make is about stress testing. So there's only a handful of states that say, well, if you put this 10 to 15% aside, is it going to cover enough? Do you have enough in this savings account, if you will, or in this reserve? And we have no requirement, as I understand this, and Dr. Ulbrich, you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, but the amendments are not suggesting that there should be any stress testing to say, well, is this in effect, or in other words, analysis that says, is this enough in effect to help us in a downturn, or are we just sort of saving only a portion of what we need, and significant budget cuts would come in education, in health, in Medicaid, all of those things. So anyway, those are just the two broader points I'll share just as a beginning, because again, I think these downturns disproportionately affect those who have the least means and who are heavily employed in certain sectors. And again, those are communities of color and women of color. And then again, do you really have sufficient analysis that it's enough? you know, which would be a good budget practice, if you will, to determine whether or not the state's doing the right thing. I'll stop there.
Okay.
Terrific. Thank you so much. And I wanted to let Dr. Hill jump in and make some observations at this point. Dr. Hill is last but not least, what are your thoughts, sir?
Hey, first off, thank you, Catherine, for inviting me. This is my first time here on this platform, so I am happy to share this panelist with my other panelists here. I think that they provided a in-depth insight into some of the things that voters need to consider when going to the poll and thinking about this initiative. My comments are kind of limited based on the facts of the economy and along that lines of growth and what we consider for South Carolina from the standpoint of growth. Traditionally speaking, any changes within the reserve funds or capital funds, when we look across all states and things like that, did depend a lot of times on the fluctuation of the economy in the state in the past. So, and if you think about it, states that have higher ups and downs, upticks, swings and stuff, they are more likely to change the reserve fund because it's harder for them to kind of predict what's going on. As we look back from 2008 and you start to look a little bit, well, let me kick it up a little bit, not just 2008, but really 2011 on up. You really look at South Carolina's economy, it's been kind of steady. It's been a something where it's been growing. Population is kind of consistent. However, there hadn't been a lot of fluctuations in ups and downs, right, within the economy. But at the same time, we do have legislative agendas that spend on different priorities. So one of the things that I think that you kind of consider is, and I think Dr. Shaw, you mentioned this, is I don't know what led to the analysis of 1%. Why not 10%, right? Why not 20% or throw out another number? So I am not understanding the analysis for the 1% as well as a 2% increase. And then also one of the things is that there's always initiatives for capital investment in infrastructure development across the state. The question that we always ask those who are elected officials is, what other priorities are important for the state that we could have utilized the funding that would be used for that? Whether it's infrastructure, broadband, and at the core of it, could it be education? Could it be those who are in the service-related fields for the state? So those are my general opening statements and comments. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And right now, I would like to attempt to play this little clip from the state budget director. And he is giving a brief history at this meeting back in March, the Senate committee meeting, of some of the background of the Capital Reserve Fund and these two reserve funds. So I think that's going to be useful. I'm going to go ahead and play that now. And I need to try to share the screen. So I'm going to try to do that. Okay, I think it's working. So let's roll.
A few sort of historical points to make by way of background. This thing goes back over 30 years.
Can you increase the volume?
The General Reserve Fund and Capital Reserve Fund was put into place in 1987 to cushion the general fund spending and to protect the state's ability to pay its bills at the close of each fiscal year. In the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, General Reserve Fund was calculated at 3% of previous year's general fund revenue collections, and the Capital Reserve Fund was calculated at 2% of previous year's general fund revenue collections. Between 1987, the first year of the use of the Capital Reserve Fund, along with the General Reserve Fund, through 2011, that 25-year period, the General Reserve Fund was exhausted 4 times, and the Capital Reserve Fund was depleted 9 times. In 2010, the General Assembly placed before the electorate a constitutional amendment to increase the size of the General Reserve Fund from 3% to 5%. Additionally, the use of the Capital Reserve Fund was changed so that it acted as a 2% buffer for the General Reserve Fund rather than as a buffer for spending during a fiscal year. These changes were largely prompted as a result of concerns expressed by credit rating agencies. Remember, this was immediately after the Great Recession, 08-09 Great Recession. And we had completely exhausted both of our reserve funds at that time. Since 2011, the General Reserve Fund and Capital Reserve Fund have not been used to close a fiscal year in deficit. Mr. Chairman, look, there are only 16 sitting senators that were in office during that time. In 2015, statutes relating to addressing a mid-year general fund deficit were changed with the elimination of the Budget and Control Board. Today, in case of revenue shortfalls, the Executive Budget Office reduces the budget automatically up to an amount of 3%. Should a shortfall be greater, then the General Assembly is notified and may reduce the budget in any manner it so chooses. It has 20 days in which to act. If no action is taken, then a mid-year across-the-board cut beyond that 3% is implemented. There's no cut anymore by a Budget and Control Board, as was previously practiced. S1106 and S3346, they work in tandem, and they are to increase the General Reserve Fund from 5% to 7%. Additionally, these pieces of legislation restore the original use of the Capital Reserve Fund as a way to protect spending during a fiscal year. So it acts as a cushion in the middle of the year so that the first 3% would not be cut from state agencies. And then the Capital Reserve Fund and the statute and the joint resolution for the constitutional amendment are increased from 2% of previous year general fund revenue to 3%. So it gives you a cushion of 50% larger. According to the National Association of State Budget Officers, the average rainy day fund balance, that's what these.
Ms. Bruce, we have a question on the floor.
Okay, we're gonna take that question. Hold on.
Was 12.1%.
Okay.
All right, the
we're ready
question
to-
on the floor, I believe, is directed towards Dr. Ulbrich. It
Okay.
is, what is the opportunity cost of going forward with these? What else could we be doing today with the money that would be going to these extra percentage points?
I think that's an excellent question, but I can't answer it because only the legislature who writes the budget does it. I can say that one of the advantages of having those reserve funds is that you might not have had the dramatic and lasting cuts in funding for public education that we experienced during and after the Great Recession, and also the cuts to higher education that made it increasingly unaffordable for our high school graduates to continue their education. Tech school is still very affordable. The tech schools are still very affordable, but the four-year institutions are not. So it's hard to say what the opportunity cost is unless you know what the legislature would do with those funds if they had not been sequestered for future crises. I wish I could say that they would have spent more on education, but this year we had a nice surplus. And in some states, by the way, they just dumped the surplus into the reserve fund. But no, they're sending us all up to $700 per taxpayer income tax refund. Money that could have gone into teacher pay, money that could have gone up to fully staffing our prisons and our social workers, money that could have been given a larger than a 3% raise. I'm on Social Security. I get an 8.7% raise. So we could have done far more for state employees. Those are opportunity costs, but they wouldn't necessarily be the decisions that the governor's office and the legislature would choose to make for the use of those funds. So I wish I could tell you what the opportunity cost was, but I can't penetrate their thinking. The other thing is, I want to address the 15%, if I may. That's a number that's used in a lot of nonprofit organizations. It's roughly basically a 2-month reserve. I think that's high for a state government. It's high in comparison with those other states that, like us, use a percentage amount rather than dumping surplus funds or having a cap on the size of the fund. There's all different kinds of solutions, but the 15% doesn't necessarily apply to the state government because they will still have a flow of tax revenues. It just won't be as high as it was. So it's not like they're going to go out of business or be unable to pay their bills. It's just that it's what this does is kind of cushion the downturn, and then we build it back in the upturn. So it's a way of the federal government since the 1930s has always had a function of trying to stabilize economic activity so that ordinary everyday life of working and earning and buying groceries and paying the mortgage doesn't get disrupted. And that's always been considered primarily a central government function. So we responded to the pandemic with some pretty big stimulus activity that resulted in stabilizing a lot of economic activity. But because states, every state except Vermont, is required to balance their budget, and I think that's a good policy, states do not have the flexibility to fight recessions and then to use the upturn to sort of replenish the funding for future recessions. So I don't think anybody on this panel, or probably anybody on this call, is opposed to having a general fund, a general reserve fund, and having a capital reserve fund. The question is, how much is the right amount? And I think given what's going on globally, I think there is a possibility of a fairly serious recession showing up in the next year or two. And so I, for one, would like to see that cushion in place.
Now, I wonder, did anyone else's eyebrows go up on listening to the budget director talk about how many times the reserve funds were depleted?
Yeah, when it was 3%, yes, and fast. It was depleted fast.
Yeah, like every year, like 4 times, 9 times. So I think that would generate some concern among the voting public with regard to how does the legislator get to the point where the funds are depleted and we have to go into our reserve funds so many times.
Yeah, well, things are a lot better than they were up till 1987, and I thank the foresighted legislators that took that path. And when I talk on public policy, I always get asked what they do in other states. One time I mentioned New York, which did not appeal to the audience, but so generally I look at what we do in other southern states, but this is sufficiently widespread. As I said, 47 of the 50 states have some kind of rainy day fund. They all have their own little ways of doing it, but we're one of at least a dozen states that has a percentage allocation. And it's not a big chunk of the budget every year, remember, unless you're doing the 0.5%. So at the end of this fiscal year, what they will owe the fund is 5.5% instead of 5. And it's going to take a little chunk of any increase. They don't have to put in 5% every year. The 5%'s there. They'll have to put in 0.5% to increase it. And then if the budget went up, say, if the revenue went up, say 8%, then they have to put in 5.5% of that. 5.5% of 8. It's a pretty small number. So it's I mean, we're talking in the millions, maybe 100 million, but out of a budget that's in excess of 10 billion, which just blew my mind how fast the state budget got that big. And I also want to go back to this issue of opportunity cost, because I don't think that we as citizens pay enough attention to the budget process. I think we should be down there testifying. I think we're going to be down there saying, it's our priority to staff these state agencies that provide essential services. It's our priority to educate our children and provide healthcare for people, and to look after the old folks, and to look after the poor rural areas that need help in economic development. I think these are important budgetary priorities. I think we're all on the same page as far as that's concerned. But the question is, how do we get our voices heard?
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We actually have a hand raised at this time.
Great.
We'd like to yield to Mr. Ronnie Steele. I've asked you to unmute. Mr. Steele? One moment, might be having just a bit of technical difficulty. All right, Mr. Steele, are you able to hear us? Oh,
Now,
there we
while
go.
we're-
We
yeah.
lost him. There he goes.
Okay,
All right,
okay.
Mr. Steele, we yield to you, sir. All right, we'll revisit that in just a moment.
Okay, well, I do want to ask generally, because I know we have a number of folks on the line who are also local municipal leaders, you know, mayors and other leaders. So is there a particular concern, since some budget items come from the state legislature? Because we think about state agencies and the mid-year cuts being to the state agencies. What about our cities? What about our counties? What kind of concern do you think they might have with any kind of cuts that might result from having more money taken out of the budget and put into a rainy day fund? Anybody? Okay, Mr. Ronnie, are you with us?
I am. I
There
had
he
to
is.
leave
There he
for
is.
just
Okay.
a minute because I didn't have my microphone where it could be accepted. So I was gone for just a minute or two.
All right.
My concern is in the fact that we haven't used it since 2008, the reserve fund is, and we turned around and gave $1 billion tax cut last year, is whether this something that Republicans are planning to use in the future is some kind of campaign thing that they secured the budget more with this increase, and yet they didn't give retirees but like a 1.9 pay increase this past year. So I don't think, they got to do more to show a need for this in my mind, because since 2008, they never used it.
Well, that's a point. What do any of y'all have a response to that?
Can I comment on that?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Actually, it was a 1% increase for retirees. And it's either 1% up to a maximum of $500 for retirees in terms of increases, annual increases. They never get more than 1%. And one of the reasons for that is that some of you may recall that we had some little issues with the management of our retirement funds back in the late 90s and into the early 70s, and the early aughts, and they reformed it in 2013 and created a retirement services investment commission, on which I've just been appointed to that, or elected to it, or whatever I was. And they say that they're working very diligently, despite a presently unfavorable stock market, to fully fund the retirement system. And there's a great deal of concern that if they provide COLAs for retirees, it will be at the expense of the stability of our investment fund. Now, if I were in the legislature, I would have put some of that money into shoring up the retirement fund directly, rather than relying on those of us charged with oversight to make a killing in the stock market and fund it that way. But both of these things are going on. So as a retiree, I understand the 1% limit, at least while we're trying to rebuild the asset pool. And that really is a place where they could have dumped some funds, surplus funds, but they did not choose to do so.
But that is a point, is that there are particular items like the retirement fund, like education. One of the Senate panelists brought up our roads and highways, and the need for there to be actually a federal mandate has been put on to say, okay, you need to put aside some money to take care of these roads, or we're not going to provide the level of funding that we have. So there are these competing needs that must be addressed. And also wanted to take a moment to try to share my screen again to show you all something from the, yeah, I'm gonna be able to do that. Okay, so this is this year's budget. And this is from NASBO that was mentioned earlier, the National Association of State Budget Officers. So it talks about South Carolina's budget. That was the budget that was passed just this year, July 1st, just to show where we are. So it shows the general fund appropriations, 10.3 billion. Total general fund revenue is anticipated to be 11.2 billion. And I think there's something in here about the two rainy day funds, the general reserve. The General Reserve Fund is fully funded for fiscal year 2023 at 732.2 million. The Capital Reserve Fund received a set aside of 209.2 million. So it seems like our two reserve funds are in good shape, according to these this report from NASBO. So once again, the question that was just asked by Mr. Steele and asked previously, you know, where are we in our rainy day fund, and do we need this at this point, is a good question. I see a question in the box. I'm going to go ahead and ask this question. It says, please sum up for me, if asked by individuals in my county wanting to understand the two amendments, what would be a 1 or 2 sentence explanation to provide to an everyday person? What is this and how should I vote? Give me an easy explanation of how to answer that question.
Good luck with that.
I need a clear, brief explanation to make to my voters in my county. And perhaps what we could do, because we, you know, I'd like to try to encourage people to do some of the thinking to make their minds up. And I know that it's a common practice for community folks to go to those leaders in their communities and say, you know, what do you think? How do I, you know, I know that's a temptation to give them an answer. But what do we need to do? What do we need to give folks to give them enough information and confidence to say, oh, this is what's going on with these two bills, with these two amendment questions. What do I need to think about? What's important to me, you know, in my community? And maybe to answer like that, to say, okay, what is important to you out of the things that are in the state budget? What things are important to you? But also to think about some of that funding comes to our county. So what funds come to our county and what of those things are important to me? So some people talked about the retirement fund. You know, I have seniors in my family, or I have people who need economic opportunity in my family because we've had a lot of struggle during COVID and maybe not back up to full employment, or we need health insurance options. So that could lead to a question about Medicaid expansion. So is there a way to answer the question that gives people enough to go back and think about it and make their own decisions? So I'll toss that to you guys.
Okay, go ahead.
Dr. Ulbrich, to circle back on that question some, there's 2 parts in my box. One is the state makes cuts. The local governments have to make up the difference midstream as well. And how do the counties have to make up the difference?
Yeah, that's a good
Oh,
question. Yes,
Okay.
both of them
Okay.
are.
Yeah, the whole question of local government is a really important one. And some of the cuts do affect like election commissions, and they certainly affect the schools, which is another form of local government. There's also funds that are shared by the state heavily to counties because they have a lot of shared responsibilities, like health services and libraries and roads, state roads and things like that. So there's a lot of shared expenses. So, but the bulk of the funds that the state shares with local governments are shared with counties. Municipalities get only about 1/6 of those shared funds. And again, they're committed to a certain percentage, but they cut it when there are budget cuts. So it's happened before and it could happen again, and it takes a long time to recover. So yeah, I think that's an important point. And also, if they underfund education, we still have to provide education. So they have to, and the only revenue source other than state aid that schools have is the property tax. So property taxes go up, and they don't fall on homeowners because of homeowner property tax relief. So they fall on rental property and businesses, which has been bearing the burden, and that's not good for our local economies. So, it's kind of a vicious circle. So we want to avoid these budget cuts to the extent possible. And that's an argument for voting for it. On the other hand, I think it's a reasonable question to say, aren't there better uses of those funds? And I think there's a distinction there between the Capital Reserve Fund and the General Reserve Fund, because the Capital Reserve Fund, it's going to get spent. It just gets replenished every year. And then it gets either spent to avoid mid-year budget cuts, or if it isn't needed for that, then it goes into capital projects that we're going to do anyway. So I can't see any reason to object to raising that from 2% to 3%. But whether we need then the increase from 5% to 7%, it's a matter of attitudes. I have friends who are extremely frugal. They're so old. Probably their parents remember the Great Depression, and so they save like crazy and leave huge sums to their descendants because they didn't need it. Or they save because they might wind up in a nursing home and it's going to cost a fortune. And then there are people who say, well, I'll just take my chances and see what happens. Well, you can do that as an individual. I'm not sure you can do that as a state. So I think it is wise for the state to say, but I can't tell you in the General Reserve Fund what is the magic number that's right. Does that help at all?
That was really critical, and obviously I'm just the admin hosting, but when you talk about what not just budget shortfalls, but cutting those budgets, how it doesn't necessarily fall on homeowners because of the relief. But when we look at in Richland County, for instance, over 400,000 people, but a large majority, some say up to 60%. We know that 91,000 children under the age of 18 are living in poverty. A majority of those people, 80% African American, but a large portion of those people, as Dr. Shaw said, are not just African Americans, but are renters.
Yes.
And those impoverished circumstances lead to a whole other host of systemic issues that then fall or are put from the State House into just one seeming category, which is crime. So it's interesting to see the correlation. My grandmother used to say, what happens with things that fall from, they have to roll downhill, they have to land somewhere. And so I think it's important for voters to know how important it is for us to pay attention to these things, because really the system is set to impact those who are already in some of the most impoverished circumstances in this state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know what? I think that in our last few minutes, because we're at 11:51, so I want to, before I do that, I want to say thank you to my co-hosts here, to all of you, to Dr. Nicholas Hill, the Dean of the School of Business at Claflin. I want to say thank you to Dr. Holley Ulbrich, who is with the League of Women Voters and a retired economist, but obviously still doing that work of the economists. To Paul T. Palmer Jr., who does so much work with advocacy organizations, including the Poor People's Campaign. and to my good friend, Dr. Todd Shaw, who is the associate faculty at University of South Carolina. Did I get that right?
Associate professor, that's just fine.
Associate professor, University of South Carolina Political Science Department. So I want to thank you all. And I still want to use this last couple of minutes to see if we can give an answer to my friend with McCormick County, who says, hey, I have people back home who are going to ask me, how should I answer this? But maybe what is a good, quick approach that she could give them? I'll start with Todd.
Yeah, I would say that here's language I'm gonna try my hand at, and thank you, Dr. Ulbrich, for your earlier comments about that 15%. It won't be the first time an economist corrects a political scientist. But I would say what you could say to voters is, how much of a buffer do you think the state needs against hard times, right, or against a rainy day? Versus how much do you think you would like to see those priorities shifted to items in the budget that are important to you? Now that puts it back on the voter to kind of think through that. And I think that's exactly what we should do, because this is a matter of trust. You have to, it's a sense of trust in your members of the legislature to do the right thing, right? There was an inference in a Post and Courier article about the capital reserve, and Dr. Ulbrich, you can speak to this, of to what degree the aspects of the capital reserve could be used in a sort of, and the article said, a slush fund way, right?
Right.
And so that still comes down to doing the right thing with those funds in question, because again, you don't, even though the legislature has it at its disposal, doesn't mean they'll use it in a certain way. And so I think, how much do you trust and that there's a need for a buffer, versus how much do you want to spend on current and increasing certain priorities in the budget? I guess that's the way I would put it, which is not an easy way, but it's the way the voter has to make their mind up as to that issue of trust.
Right. Okay, and there is a whole week, this whole week to do a little thinking and homework to come to a conclusion. Now, Dr. Nicholas, do you have any way that you could express to folks back home in a nutshell?
Yeah. So in my mind, I'm sitting here trying to quickly do the calculations based off of the budget. It looks like in some cases we're talking roughly around $120 million for one initiatives, and roughly maybe about 240 or something like that. So what could the state do with almost $300 million, right? Like, so that's the broader question is and I think all of the panelists have said, there's other initiatives out there that you may want to consider. Now, if you think, well, we can utilize that $300+ million to do some savings just in case there are some capital considerations that we need to have set up just in case. If that's where your premise is, that's the easiest answer. Yes. But if you think that there are some other ways that the government or the state can utilize roughly, and this is estimation, in my head, $300+ million that they will now be able to receive, then that becomes the issue for the voters to consider.
Thank you. Okay. Paul, what do you say?
Well, I think that part of the issue is for the state government's budget is a pie. Think of that as a pie, and increasing the slice of the pie simply for savings does have with certainty short-term cost of opportunities being provided for poor and low wealth people. Not all of the state money's paid for, supports poor and low wealth people, but a portion of it more directly impacts them. And that's that's part of the reason why I think that it would be most advantageous to the poor people of South Carolina to hold back on that. And increasing the pie is a political consideration, but if we were to increase the whole pie to cover that increase in the reserve fund, the general reserve fund and the capital reserve fund, well, I wouldn't, I'd have to say that in that hypothetical situation, yes, go for it, because then that would be giving a little bit better protection for the poor people who work for the state and the people that receive the funds for that.
Yes, thank you. And speaking of poor people, I do want to interject here that one of the clips I didn't have a chance to show you, later remarks by the budget director at that meeting. One thing he said was that the reason for doing this constitutional amendment in prior years is because they were looking at the credit. You know, the people who look at the state's credit had some concerns. And the question was asked, well, what is our current credit rating? So one credit agency gave us 3 A+, one gave us 2 A+. And the reason for the holdback was because of the per capita income of people in South Carolina.
Mhm.
And just the amount of people who are in the economy working is not very high. So someone said to that remark, oh, well, maybe we need to increase the minimum wage. And that was kind of, you know, put in there.
You think?
But yeah, so this is one of the things that is a concern is what is the state's credit rating, so that so that's one of the reasons why they wanted to make this shift. But we have things that we're not doing as a state.
If I can just
that
comment on the
impact
credit
us
rating.
negatively, yes.
If we have if our credit rating is lower, we pay more interest on borrowing. So you can get it one way or you can get it the other way. It's not a dollar
Yes.
offset, but it is a relevant consideration.
Right, and that's you know, the same for all of us. You know, if we have that.
Our FICO score goes down.
Yeah, our FICO score, the
That's right.
same thing. So the state's FICO score has some work to be done because of the number of low wage people in there.
But also because of the reserve funds. That was the issue, was that if we don't have enough reserves to see us through, then maybe we won't be able to pay back our loans. And so.
Okay, and I do, yeah, I think I see people going. I did want to say that we had a wonderful audience here. We had more than 50 people to sign up for this session, which is fantastic. And those are people from around the state. We had elected officials on. We had people who were engaged in advocacy. We had folks from different perspectives, political perspectives on today because it's a nonpartisan event. So thank you all very much for joining us. We do want to give our panel an opportunity to say one final word. Do want to thank Javar Juarez, BRBA, for making sure that, you know, nothing went wrong with the technology and for putting in a good word. Thank you, Javar. So let's have some final conversation, final remarks from each of our panelists. What do you want the takeaway to be from people who joined today? You want to start, Dr. Holley?
Yeah, I think a stronger reserve fund probably does more to protect poor people than anything else that the legislature is likely to do.
Thank you. Okay, who's next? Paul?
I just want to say thank you for giving an opportunity to speak to this today. I'll have to commend Dr. Ulbrich for giving her economic background and perspective on that. I feel like Todd Shaw there gave for the concerns for the poor people. He had a stump speech that was ready to go. Better than mine. So I commend him.
Thank you, good sir.
How he said that.
Okay, Dr. Todd.
Well, thank you very much for this panel. I think it's important for voters to understand this sort of quote unquote technical matter, because it has real world consequences. And I appreciate the county leader who asked about how can I put this in plain spoken language, because that's how we have to convey it. How much do you think it is important for there to be a buffer, but then also how do we need to have a rainy day against the most vulnerable populations? So thank you for being here, and thank you for this invitation. I learned something myself that I'll take back into the classroom.
Yeah, great, thank you. And Dr. Nicholas.
Hey, I'm gonna close it out. Thank you all for having me. I'm excited to share the stage with wonderful and talented panelists. So thank you again, and thank you, Catherine, for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Oh, glad you're able to accept, all of you. And, thank you for giving us the opportunity to let people know that these things are on the ballot, these kind of eye-popping questions that really deserve some thought. And B, thank you for allowing the opportunity for people to come and get their cup filled with the information that they need to make a good decision on election day. So thank you again. Thank you all for being with us. And we look forward to doing this again. Please check out my YouTube channel, Catherine Fleming Bruce for U.S. Senate, because this is one place where this is going to go. And if you go ahead and subscribe to that and hit the notifications link, then you will be informed when this video is up, so you can share that with other people in your county and in your networks. So once again, good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, and have a great one.
Thank you.
Thank you.